It is the 19th of May, 1536. At the Tower of London, a raven-haired woman, accused of high treason, approaches the scaffold. After ascending the steps, she turns to face the gathered crowd and recites a prepared speech in which she praises King Henry and bids the people to pray for her soul. She then kneels on the straw scattered on the floor and prays herself until silently the French executioner approaches from behind and, with a single swing of his sword, decapitates the noble lady. Her name, one-time Queen of England, Anne Boleyn.
Before we begin, a quick word from our sponsor, Skillshare, the online learning community for people like you who are curious and love learning. Skillshare offers a choice of classes to develop your skills, including classes on photography, design, history, and even memory techniques to enhance your knowledge or increase your well-being, using proven study techniques to provide inspiring learning that fits into your schedule. And with no ads, you learn uninterrupted, when you want to, for less than $10 per year. If you're interested in vlogging, we would recommend How to Vlog, the Complete Beginner's Guide by Jevin Dovey. This succinct and expertly delivered course will tell you everything you need to know to become the next YouTube sensation. And remember, the first 1,000 people to use the link in the video description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership.
The woman known to history as Anne Boleyn was born in or around 1501 at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, although sometime in her early childhood, the family would move to what would become their principal residence, which was Hever Castle in Kent. Her father was Sir Thomas Boleyn, intelligent, well-educated, and fluent in French. He was also very ambitious, promoted by Henry VII to Deputy Warden for Customs at Calais. Anne's great-grandfather was Lord Mayor of London in 1457, Sir Geoffrey Boleyn, a successful merchant who bought the family seats of both Blickling Hall and Hever Castle. Anne's mother was Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Earl of Surrey, who would latterly become the second Duke of Norfolk. Elizabeth Howard was a noble woman who served as lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon during the early part of the reign of Henry VIII. The Howards could rightfully claim to move in royal circles, not least because Anne's uncle, the third Duke of Norfolk, had married the daughter of Edward IV, Anne of York. Anne was educated to a high standard, along with her siblings, by members of her household, and it was Anne and her brother George who were the better students, the two also sharing a particular closeness as brother and sister. Anne would have learned the traditional lessons of the time, such as reading and writing, as well as languages and music, but she also would have been taught the traditionally feminine lessons of needlework, dancing, and singing. Only two of Anne's siblings survived into adulthood. They were George and Mary. However, their ages and even the order of their birth is a point of contention, although the probable order was that Mary was the oldest, as per Lord Hunsdon's account, and that Anne was the middle child, born before George, who was born in either 1504 or 1505, making Anne's probable birth date sometime around 1501. Anne was considered the less attractive of the two sisters, and rumours abound that she was born with physical marks of a large mole on her neck and an extra finger on one hand, attributes that would have aroused suspicion that she carried, quote, marks of the devil. Anne took care to hide these marks, and they did not appear in her portraiture. She also had black hair and dark eyes, not the conventional picture of beauty at the time. Despite her unusual marks on her body, and the fact that she was not the oldest Boleyn girl, her intelligence meant that her ambitious father, Thomas Boleyn, chose Anne to send into service as a lady-in-waiting at the court of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands, and so she left England for the first time in 1513, entering the household of Margaret of Austria in Brussels. She would have set out for Brussels with a contingent of her father's servants, beginning the journey with anticipation and excitement at taking up such a sought-after position, as well as with her father's words in mind to make sure she made the best of herself as the representative of the family abroad at one of the most cultured courts in Europe. She quickly made a good impression at the Dutch court, and Margaret of Austria wrote to Thomas Boleyn, stating how pleased she was to receive his daughter. Anne made good progress in learning the French language, and wrote a long letter in French to her father, which is the first example of Anne's own voice in original sources. After the King of France, Louis XII's wife, died in 1514, he requested of Henry VIII the hand in marriage of his sister, Mary Tudor, who travelled to France to become queen. By this time, Anne's fluency in French had become well known, and her father was asked to send her from Brussels to France to serve under Mary Tudor. This would have been a difficult request for Thomas Boleyn to ask of Margaret of Austria, as there were rumours that Margaret herself may have been a likely candidate for marriage to King Louis. Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, travelled with Mary Tudor to France, as she was by now part of Mary's household. Anne travelled directly from Brussels to France and joined the French court, and was also reunited with her sister there. And when after their marriage, King Louis sent many of Mary Tudor's attendants home to England, Anne and her sister Mary were two who were spared, and so they would have been quite close confidants to the new queen. However, when King Louis died only 3 months after their marriage, most of Mary Tudor's attendants returned to England with her in May 1515, but Anne and Mary Boleyn decided to stay at the French court in the new Queen Claude's household. Anne had most likely acted as an interpreter between Mary Tudor and her stepdaughter, Claude, when Louis was still alive, and so the relationship they formed must have been a good one, since Anne stayed in Queen Claude's service for the next 7 years. Whilst Queen Claude's court was quiet and demure, that of her husband Francis I was much more debauched and frivolous, and both Mary and Anne would on occasion visit the king's court in the course of their duties. During this time, Mary Boleyn gained quite a reputation for being generous with her sexual favours, even earning the nickname the English Mare, and becoming the mistress of both Francis I and several other French courtiers when he discarded her. And when word reached Mary's family in England of her behaviour, she was sent for to return home, ending what must have been an embarrassing time for Anne at the French court. Whilst Anne was at the court of Queen Claude, she would have spent much of her time doing needlework and playing music, but also during this time, she met with the sister of Francis I, Marguerite of Angoulême, who may have influenced Anne with her reformist views. Anne would have had the opportunity of seeing her father during her time at the French court, as Thomas Boleyn took part in several court visits from England, one of which was for the christening of Francis I and Queen Claude's son, Henry, Duke of Orleans, in 1519. She would also have met him at the famous Field of Cloth of Gold meeting between Francis I and Henry VIII in 1518. Although not recorded as such, Anne would almost certainly have been present at the famous meeting between the kings, as one of the ladies in waiting to the French queen, and this would also probably have been the first time that she had set eyes on her future husband, King Henry VIII, who was 30 at the time and in his prime, as well as the first time that she would have seen Catherine of Aragon, the king's older wife. Anne would return to England after nearly 9 years abroad in 1522, after her father requested her presence in late 1521, and by February or March 1522, she had become a member of the household of Catherine of Aragon in Greenwich. Anne's presence at court caused a stir. She was seen as somewhat of a fashion icon, as well as being possessed of considerable poise, grace, and charm. Even her detractors at the time wrote of the magnetism of her demeanour. In March 1522, Anne was chosen to take part in a play, or masque, at court, in which 8 princesses, dressed in white satin, would portray various virtues. Mary Tudor would portray beauty, whilst Anne's sister Mary would portray kindness, and Anne was chosen to portray perseverance. By the time Anne returned to court in England, her sister Mary was mistress to King Henry VIII, an involvement that would last for several years, despite Mary's marriage to William Carey in 1521, which was thought a cover to protect her reputation should she fall pregnant by the king. Mary's relationship with Henry could also be the reason for Thomas Boleyn's progression, as he was made controller of the household in 1520 and treasurer of the household in 1522, as well as being made Viscount Rochford in 1525. However, Mary received little from her relationship with Henry after she was discarded in 1525. This treatment may have well warned Anne to hold out for what she wanted when looking for marriage and love, and this she would make sure she did. What Anne hadn't realised when she left France was that she was being summoned home in order that she should be married. Thomas Boleyn and Cardinal Wolsey, in talks with King Henry, had arranged for Anne to be married to the eldest son of Sir Piers butler, James, to avoid a succession disagreement over the rightful ownership of the title of the Earlship of Ormond, over which Thomas Boleyn had a claim, as did the butlers. It seems that Anne was not keen on the match between herself and James Butler. Her delaying tactics eventually proved successful, and the marriage idea dwindled and never in fact happened. despite having the approval of the king. Anne wanted an advantageous marriage for herself, and was also known as a willful character. She defied the conventions of the time and arranged a marriage for herself. Her chosen partner was Henry Percy, heir to the earldom of Northumberland. It was a very good match for Anne, and Henry Percy immediately fell deeply in love with her. It has been speculated that following their engagement, they may have actually consummated their relationship, as Anne would have been eager to ensure her path to becoming Countess of Northumberland. This fact could also have been known to Lady Wingfield, who Anne wrote to quite humbly before her later marriage to Henry, probably hoping to keep the matter a secret. The marriage never in fact happened, as the king heard of their plans and instructed Wolsey to put a stop to it. He summoned Percy to him, forbidding the marriage on the grounds that Anne was beneath him in terms of rank. Anne was furious at this decision, and held a grudge against Cardinal Wolsey for the decision. Henry Percy pined for Anne and was almost continually ill until his death in his early 30s. Following her failed engagement, Anne returned to Hever Castle and became reacquainted with her next love interest, her neighbour Thomas Wyatt, whose family was well known by Thomas Boleyn, as Wyatt's father, Sir Henry Wyatt, had been created a Knight of the Bath, along with Thomas Boleyn at Henry VIII's coronation, and they shared the office of Constable of Norwich Castle from 1511. Thomas was a handsome, athletic figure, as well as a poet who was well respected at court. The only downside was that Wyatt was already married, and so their relationship remained a flirtation, which continued when Anne was called back to Catherine of Aragon's court in 1525. However, Wyatt's writing made it clear that he was highly attracted to Anne, and did in fact love her, with some sources suggesting that their relationship may have actually been more than platonic. However, Anne's feelings for and extent of relationship with Wyatt is ultimately uncertain. Several sources claim that Anne was not at all chaste and virtuous, and that Thomas Wyatt was allowed into her bed, and that she may have even entertained other lovers as well, with one writer claiming that the first was her father's butler when she was a girl of only 15. Another more salacious anti-Boleyn rumour stated that Henry VIII, who had found Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, attractive, had fathered Anne. However, this is highly unlikely, as Henry would have only been 16 at the time, and still under the protection of his father, Henry VII. The accounts of her carrying on an affair with Wyatt also seem unlikely, as there were several other likely candidates she could have chosen who were not married, and as well as this, she would hold back from sleeping with the king until they were eventually married. Both arguments point to the inaccuracy of the Wyatt affair being anything more than simple flirtation. By the mid-1520s, Queen Catherine of Aragon's failure to produce a son and heir would have made King Henry more and more impatient, and because Catherine was, more or less, constantly pregnant for the first decade of her marriage, Henry was used to taking mistresses, even fathering an illegitimate son, whom Henry acknowledged as his own child. The boy was named Henry Fitzroy, literally meaning son of the king. He was born in June of 1519. His mother, Elizabeth Blount, one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. Henry had proven that he could father a son, and while Henry never openly blamed Catherine for her failure to produce a boy, it is likely that the continued absence of a legitimate heir, some 10 years into his marriage, stoked resentment as well as anxiety in him, especially as Henry was now 27 years old and Catherine was 33, and so the time left for her to conceive was growing short, and within a decade, Henry's attempts to address the absence of an heir would change the face of England forever. Culturally, Henry was a devout Catholic, and evidence suggests that he essentially remained so throughout his life. However, his commitment to the Pope's right to govern the Church would present him with perhaps his greatest dilemma, when his views conflicted with both his desire to remarry and his increasingly desperate need for a son and heir, the one thing that seemed to be out of his reach. By the mid-1520s, the situation became more strained. Henry was no longer the popular teenage king, but was still a fairly young man, in his early 30s, and never having abandoned his athletic lifestyle and pursuits, he had kept his trim handsomeness and vigour. Catherine, however, was nearing 40, and had gained a great deal of weight in the years since her marriage. As well as this, 6 pregnancies in 9 years had wreaked havoc on her body, and Catherine, now past childbearing age, was losing both the love and interest of her husband. When Anne Boleyn came to the Tudor court in 1525 as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, having recently returned from the French court of Queen Claude, she must have been a breath of fresh air to the king. She was much admired for her cosmopolitan air, her style, wit, and charm, and still in her mid-20s, She was fashionable and attractive, with dark hair and eyes, and commanded attention at court, and Henry, longing for a younger, more vivacious wife who might give him a son, fell deeply in love with her. The affair of Anne's sister with the king ended before 1526, and so on her return to court, Anne was seemingly available, and King Henry was on the lookout for another mistress. Anne continued her flirtatious behaviour with Thomas Wyatt at court, Thomas at one point taking a jewel from Anne which he kept on his person, presumably as a reminder of her. During this time, both Henry and Wyatt vied for the attention of Anne, before Wyatt realised just how serious the king was about winning her hand. Henry also took a ring from Anne and began wearing it on his little finger at the time, the first indication perhaps that his feelings for her were deepening, and in 1528, King Henry made Wyatt Marshal of Calais, perhaps to make sure Wyatt was absent from court to clear the way for Henry to secure his relationship with Anne. Initially, for the first few months of their courtship, there seemed to be no question of Henry casting off his wife. He frequently begged Anne to become his mistress, which she refused to do, as although she was flattered to receive the attention of the king, she insisted that she would give her virginity only to her husband. Henry's letters to Anne from 1526 and 1527, some of which survive, are full of passionate declarations of his love and desire for her. Henry continually commissioned new jewels and trinkets for her, and publicly showed her favour and affection. In historical terms, Anne Boleyn had been given the reputation of the other woman, at worst, a grasping political climber and conspirator who usurped the place of a legitimate wife and queen, much loved by the English people. However, there is no evidence that she encouraged Henry's interest in her initially. Indeed, she reportedly made an abrupt departure from court in the spring of 1527, returning to her family's home at Hever Castle, and the letter that Henry wrote to Anne, soon after her departure, conveys the impression that she might have simply left to avoid Henry's ardour, and avoid turning down a king who held power over the livelihood and lives of the entire court. The letter from Henry reads, quote, "In turning over in my mind the contents of your last letters, I have put myself into great agony, not knowing how to interpret them, whether to my disadvantage, as you show in some places, or to my advantage, as I understand them in some others, beseeching you earnestly to let me know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us two. It is absolutely necessary for me to obtain this answer, having been for above a whole year stricken with the dart of love, and not yet sure whether I shall fail of finding a place in your heart and affection." While some might accuse her of playing a skillful game of manipulation, it seems unlikely that a young woman like Anne, from a respectable but not a powerful family, would imagine that she would be anything more than Henry's temporary mistress. It is difficult to believe that Anne might be presumptuous enough to think that she could take Henry from his legitimate wife, or that she might emerge victorious from a battle with the Queen of England. At the time, Anne was still set on arranging a high-ranking marriage for herself, and may have seen the status that the king's attention gave her as a distinct advantage in the marriage market, making her seem all the more worthy to would-be suitors. The alternative account, that she set out to take the king from his wife, is unlikely, but her mixed messages confused and frustrated the king until he became besotted by this alluring, seemingly unattainable woman. However, it is true that a mere liaison with the king would have no doubt placed her marriage prospects and future prosperity at great risk, and so it is likely that she came to love Henry as he loved her. After her abrupt departure from court, Henry continued writing to Anne in his own hand and sending her gifts, and in time, Anne began to respond to Henry with feelings and gifts of her own, and the two began carrying on their relationship quite publicly at court. There is, of course, no way to know whether Anne and Henry maintained their abstinence, as Anne had insisted she must. However, the fact that Anne did not become pregnant throughout the nearly 7 years of their courtship suggests she stayed chaste. Methods of contraception were available at the time, but were extremely unreliable. So while Henry and Anne were likely intimate with one another, there is no evidence which suggests that they slept together prior to late 1532, at the earliest. Their intimacy is attested to in their letters to one another, in one of which Henry mentions that he misses Anne's duckies, an informal term for her breasts. By 1527, a year after Anne's arrival at court, Henry had proposed marriage to Anne, and she had, after much thought, accepted. Henry decided to seek a divorce from Catherine so that he could marry Anne. Henry's rationale for the divorce has been argued by some to illustrate the fundamental flaws in his personality, a tendency towards cold abandonment and indifference, towards those he had no more use for, as well as a willingness to interpret facts to suit himself. When Henry had first married Catherine, he had done so against objections from all sides. Because he loved her, the Pope issued a special dispensation to allow Henry to marry Catherine, since she had been first wed to Henry's brother, Arthur, and Henry and Catherine's marriage, according to Catholic doctrine, could otherwise have been considered incest, based on a provision in Leviticus 20:21. Quote, "If any man should take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they will be childless." And so, when the teenage Henry had wanted to marry Catherine of Aragon, he readily accepted both the Pope's dispensation and Catherine's claim that her 6-month marriage to his brother Arthur had never actually been consummated due to Arthur's continual ill health. It was not until years later, when Henry had fallen in love with Anne, and the possibility of having a son had become realistic again, that Henry decided that Catherine and Arthur's marriage may not have been consummated. He reasoned that the Pope had overreached his own authority, and that the very reason he had no son was because his current marriage was a sin against God, for which divorce was the only remedy. Henry's ambition for love and an heir changed everything. The king would spend the next few years pursuing the great matter of his divorce. He began with a direct appeal to Pope Clement VII, hoping that his noted devotion to the Catholic Church would secure him an annulment, a prospect which, at the time, was not as outrageous a request as it seems today, as for literally centuries, various successive popes had dissolved literally dozens of royal marriages, even marriages of relatively long duration, which had already produced children, most of which were annulled for political reasons, although official annulments always cited some biblical or doctrinal explanation for the dissolution of these marriages. However, Henry was about to find his dreams of a quick and easy divorce dashed when in 1527, Emperor Charles V sacked Rome and took the Pope as his prisoner. In addition to being arguably the most powerful man in Europe, Charles was also Queen Catherine's nephew, and by this point, even if the Pope had wished to grant Henry his divorce, he would have been unable to. Henry then turned to Cardinal Wolsey, who had never failed him, and who owed literally all he had to the king. Thomas Wolsey was not born to the nobility like most clergymen of the day, who became archbishops, cardinals, and papal legates. Wolsey was the son of a butcher from Ipswich, originally an obscure chaplain, until, under Henry's patronage, he was made bishop, archbishop, and cardinal in fairly quick succession. Wolsey had not only been Henry's Lord Chancellor, he had also been his mentor, as a young king still finding his way. But whatever the reason for Wolsey's failure to procure the divorce, whether inability or reluctance, it would lead to his ruin. The cardinal, working with Cardinal Campeggio, a special legate appointed by the Pope, set up a legatine court to determine Henry's great matter, but the court was unable to reach a decision with regard to the merit of Henry's claims for an annulment, and ruled that the matter should be decided by the College of Cardinals in Rome. It is unclear whether Wolsey truly wanted to give Henry his desire, or if, like his ecclesiastical counterparts, he saw the danger of allowing the king to divorce his famously pious Catholic wife and marry Anne, who was reliably rumoured to be a Lutheran reformer. But whatever his intentions, the failure of the legatine court was Wolsey's downfall, as Henry commanded his arrest and imprisonment, citing the treasonous tone of letters Wolsey had written to the Vatican officials. However, the cardinal in fact died of natural causes on his way to London before Henry could behead him. Henry did not sit idly by, waiting for the College of Cardinals or the Pope to decide the fate of his marriage. Instead, he began to canvass the opinion of theologians at Europe's universities, asking them to study, deliberate, and pronounce a verdict on the merits of his case for divorce. However, Henry would be disappointed twice more, as the majority of university theologians, and later the College of Cardinals, would decide in favour of Queen Catherine, declaring the king's first marriage valid after all. It is unclear when Henry first began to consider repudiating the Pope's authority in England, thus removing the obstacle to his divorce. Anne Boleyn's influence as a Lutheran sympathiser and reformer is entirely plausible, as is the influence of Thomas Cromwell, another reformer, who was first Henry's private secretary and later rose to become Lord Privy Seal. In fact, there were quite a few reformers in the English Parliament, and at court, at the time, and anti-clericalism was rife among them, but perhaps it was his introduction to the little-known clergyman and theology professor from Cambridge, Thomas Cranmer, which truly planted the seed in his mind. According to Cranmer, who was a passionate reformer, kings, anointed by God, answered only to God, and therefore Henry should not have to pursue his divorce through legal means. This atmosphere and these ideas may have emboldened Henry to formally break with the Roman Catholic Church and pursue one of the most radical bids for power ever made by a European monarch, the claim to absolute powers of both king and pope. It would take nearly 2 years for Henry to establish the fulfilment of his will over both Parliament and the English clergy, but by 1532, Henry had what he wanted. He was the supreme head of the Church of England, and Parliament had legislated a full break with the Pope, stopping virtually all payments to Rome, and because he wanted his great matter decided by the English Church, which was much better from a public relations standpoint than declaring it himself, he made Thomas Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury, empowering him to lead the clergy to the right decision, in other words, to vote in Henry's favour with regard to his divorce. In April 1533, Archbishop Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid, but by that time, Henry had already been remarried for 3 months, having wed Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony on the 25th of January 1533. As well as this, Anne had already made her first appearance at court as queen and had taken up residence in what had been Catherine of Aragon's apartments, also taking up the motto, the most happy. However, controversially, some historians suggest that when she came to the altar, Anne was already pregnant, as on the 7th of September 1533, just over 7 months after their marriage, Anne gave birth to Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I of England. The king, once married, had wanted Anne to be crowned queen speedily, due to her burgeoning pregnancy, as he wanted his expected child to be born to a consecrated mother, and so plans went ahead for Anne's coronation. As part of her procession, Anne would take a barge, and she made sure that it was Catherine of Aragon's barge that was commandeered for the royal procession. Reportedly, she had Catherine's coat of arms not only removed from the barge, but also destroyed. The festivities began on the 29th of May, 1533, and lasted for 5 days. The king wanted Anne's ceremony to reflect that she was every inch the magnificent queen he wanted her to be seen as, and so on the 31st of May, Anne's procession left the tower, consisting of foreign ambassadors and nobles bedecked in purple robes, ermine, and other finery, followed by Anne, carried in a litter, accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting, also finely attired in resplendent fashion, all to the salute of guns from the tower and pageants at the roadside. The sight must have been astonishing for spectators lining the route. However, when Anne noticed that some of the crowd were not doffing their caps and calling "God Save the Queen," Anne had one of her attendants approach the Lord Mayor to complain of it. He replied that, quote, he could not command people's hearts, and that even the king could not do so. Despite the blatant signs of her unpopularity, Anne was resolute. She would be crowned queen, and she was, on the very next morning, in Westminster Abbey by Archbishop Cranmer. Anne was never a popular queen, as papers from the time attest to subjects being taken to task over comments on the marriage and rudeness to her personally, and in 1533, a priest was recorded as being subject to investigation over calling Anne a harlot and a whore, and quoting a prophecy that a queen would be burned at Smithfield. This and similar incidents led to the king issuing a proclamation that anyone who came forward with information against those who spoke out against his marriage would be offered a reward. Despite the apparent loyalty and favour the king showed to Anne, this did not translate to the marriage bed, as although the king had been faithful to Anne during their courtship, the same was not true of their marriage, and by 1533, Henry already had a mistress, and Anne Boleyn knew of her. This must have struck Anne like a lightning bolt, as until she gave Henry his son, her position was reliant only on his passion for her, which was perhaps waning. When Anne reacted angrily to the news of the affair, the king rebuked her with righteous indignation, not speaking to her again for 2 or 3 days. Her detractors at court must have reacted gleefully at this first hint of a rift in the royal marriage, and Anne decided not to raise the matter until she had given birth to her child, who she fully expected to be a son. On the 7th of September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, to both hers and Henry's great regret. The expected son had not arrived, and the planned tournament to greet his birth was cancelled, but once their initial disappointment waned, the couple accepted the new baby happily. She was his heir after all, until a son appeared, and she was happy and healthy and looked like the king. They named their daughter Elizabeth, the name not only of Henry's mother, but Anne's also. Baby Elizabeth was christened, and Thomas Cranmer was named as her godfather, and the Duchess of Norfolk and the Marchioness of Dorset were named as her godmothers, and after her christening, the baby was proclaimed Princess of England, as well as heiress, supplanting her half-sister Mary in the line of succession. As Queen, Anne divided opinion both at home and abroad. Some loved her, but many hated her, some due to her lowly origins, and some because Catherine had always been such a popular queen, but they hated her also because of Anne's reformist religious views, which were alien to a great portion of the largely Catholic population. One person who spoke out against Anne, and was a thorn in both hers and Henry's side, was a young woman called Elizabeth Barton, who claimed to have been cured of an illness miraculously by God. She became a nun and claimed to prophesy the future, telling Henry that she had seen a place for him prepared in hell, and that he would stop being a king a month after his marriage to Anne. In November 1533, Henry had Barton arrested, and she confessed after questioning that all her claims had been a sham. She was executed along with 5 of her associates on the 20th of April 1534. As a reformist queen, Anne set an example in her court by reading the Bible and entreating her courtiers to be both godly and pious. Although she would have had music and dancing at court, she demonstrated a degree of reformist fervour and would read her Bible in French as well as English. She also did charitable works distributing alms to the poor and also supporting a Cambridge scholar. In her brief time as queen, Anne also secured several bishoprics for reformist clergymen, including Thomas Cranmer and Hugh Latimer, who became Bishop of Worcester. She also offered sanctuary at court to foreign reformers who needed it. As well as this, she had a great love for her daughter, as did Henry, and it must have been a wrench for Anne when the princess was given her own household in December 1533, as was usual for the time. Henry well understood the enormity of what he had done by removing the power of Rome in order to marry Anne, and he moved swiftly to consolidate his new powers and impose his will implacably upon the English people. Catherine of Aragon was still widely popular, and her replacement Queen Anne was widely resented, but more importantly, the majority of the English people still identified closely with Roman Catholicism. Henry knew he would have to establish control quickly, before foreign influence and support of Catholic Europe emboldened uneasy Catholic Englishmen to act, and his answer was the Act of Supremacy, which he proposed following his marriage to Anne, and which Parliament passed in 1534. The Act required all the king's subjects to swear an oath, recognising Henry as supreme head of the church, and affirming the legality of the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Refusal to swear the oath was considered treason, the punishment for which was death. For devoted Catholics, the oath of supremacy was seen as a referendum on morality. Most chose to swear the oath and escape with their lives, no matter how painful the cost to their beliefs. Others, like Henry's old friend and mentor, Sir Thomas More, would not. More had largely retired from court and public life in general, following the death of Thomas Wolsey. Henry had named More Lord Chancellor, a post which he resigned from only 2 years later, in 1532, alienated and demoralised by the erosion of the papal authority he had witnessed at court. He had never spoken publicly against the king or against his marriage to Anne, but as of 1535, he remained one of only a few of Henry's subjects who still had not taken the oath. More's refusal to do so resulted in him being imprisoned in the Tower, and at his trial, when it was clear that he would be found guilty, he loudly affirmed the authority of the Pope over all matters religious, and denied the ability of Parliament to declare the king head of the Church. More was immediately sentenced to death for treason, a crime which carried the penalty of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Henry had already demonstrated that he was not averse to removing his subjects when they failed to deliver, challenged his power, or acted contrary to his will, but perhaps it is a small testament to his remembrance of More's friendship and service to him that Henry commuted his sentence to beheading. On the 6th of July, 1535, Thomas More went bravely to the scaffold. He jokingly asked the executioner to hold a moment while he shifted his beard from the edge of the block, saying that after all, it was he, not it, that had committed treason, and in a loud clear voice, he declared that he died, quote, the king's good servant and God's first. As well as More, Queen Catherine and Mary also refused to sign the oath, which Henry and Anne saw as a direct act of defiance. That Anne and Catherine hated each other was no secret, and it could have been under pressure from Anne that Henry demoted Queen Catherine to the rank of Princess Dowager and had her moved to a household further from London. The royal couple were probably not best pleased to hear that the crowds had cheered the old queen on her journey there. In December 1533, Henry and Anne decided that Catherine should move house once again, this time to Somersham, a house surrounded by a moat and marshes, and by reputation, a most unhealthy place. Catherine protested at her forced move and locked herself in her rooms, refusing the Duke of Suffolk's attempts to remove her. Catherine had not been allowed to see her daughter Mary since the summer of 1531, when Henry had left Catherine, but she wrote to her daughter in September 1533, preparing her for possible troubles ahead and warning her not to incur the king's anger. By this time, Henry had already replaced Mary's livery on her household coaches with that of his own, in effect, declaring her illegitimacy. A delegation was also sent to her requesting that she relinquish her title, Princess of England, and although it may have been Anne who inspired this action against his daughter, it was ultimately the king who ordered it carried out. In November 1533, Henry ordered that Mary's household should be dismantled, and that she would be sent instead to serve as lady-in-waiting to her sister Elizabeth at court. Mary went to Elizabeth's household, but was defiant, stating that she would not call her Princess of England, but sister instead, just as she called Henry Fitzroy brother. Anne appointed her aunt Lady Shelton as Mary's governess, so she would have a direct line of information about what was going on at court, and in particular, of how Mary was behaving. Anne was also terrified that the king would meet with his daughter Mary, and so when Henry visited Elizabeth's household, Mary would be confined to her rooms. But when on one occasion Henry saw Mary at her window whilst leaving, he waved at his daughter, but was berated by Anne for doing so. As Anne's attempts to make Mary behave as she wished her to were not working, Anne instead tried to befriend her stepdaughter. In March 1534, whilst visiting Elizabeth, Anne asked for Mary to be brought to her. She offered her reconciliation with her father in exchange for her admitting that she was illegitimate and that her parents had never been married. However, Mary defiantly refused, angering Anne yet again. Certain sources have stated that Anne had told Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, that she was planning to murder her rival Mary by administering her poison, and that she called Catherine and Mary rebels and traitresses, deserving death. But the truth is this was probably more wishful thinking and words spoken in anger, rather than any real plot. Indeed, there is evidence from Anne's letters to Mary to suggest that Anne did try to befriend her stepdaughter. In one letter, in which she refers to herself as Queen, she thanks Mary for curtsying to her after a mass at Eltham, and she says that she would have done the same back if she had seen her at the time. However, Mary's reply was as defiant as ever, stating that the Queen, meaning her mother Catherine, was not present at the time, and that she was actually curtsying to the altar, and so, Anne's attempts to be kind to Mary seem to have gone unheeded, and this response from Mary angered Anne greatly. Another incident in 1534, involving her own family, also prompted anger from Anne, when her sister Mary appeared at Anne's court and announced that she had married one of her servants, William Stafford. This so angered Anne that she banished her sister Mary from court, also cutting her off from any financial support, and whilst it was known that the two sisters were not close, Anne's reaction could be seen as quite harsh under the circumstances. Apart from the defiance from Mary, by 1534, Henry and Anne had finally dealt with, or removed, all who seemed openly opposed to the new order, and the death of Catherine of Aragon, from natural causes, on the 7th of January 1536, appeared to remove the last barrier to the legitimacy of their marriage. However, a black cloud hovered. Anne had become pregnant twice, following the birth of Elizabeth, but both pregnancies had resulted in miscarriages. Additionally, some historians have speculated that Henry and Anne's relationship was growing increasingly strained due to Anne's failure to adjust to her new role of wife. As Henry's mistress, she might have been allowed a certain amount of license to speak and act as she pleased. Her prolonged refusal to sleep with Henry likely put her in a rather dominant position. However, as Henry's wife, she would be expected to be far more submissive, but of course, her lack of submissiveness would likely have been overlooked had she not committed the terrible sin of failing to produce a son. Following the miscarriage Anne suffered in the summer of 1534, King Henry had taken another mistress. When Anne complained to the king about this situation, his reaction was very harsh. He stated that, quote, she had good reason to be content with what he had done for her, which he would not do now if the thing were to begin, and that she should consider from what she had come. The king was clearly losing patience with Anne, as well as perhaps regretting marrying her at all. Anne realised that without a son, she was in a very insecure and vulnerable position, exactly the position that Catherine had been in, ironically, and she felt she must act. She took Lady Rochford, her her sister-in-law, into her confidence and conspired to have Henry's latest mistress removed from court. However, their plan failed and only resulted in Lady Rochford being banished from court. By early 1535, Anne was becoming even more isolated at court. Her confidant was now gone, and she had alienated many others through her outbursts of anger, and even her husband preferred the company of his mistress. It was during this time that his daughter Mary started to come back into favour with Henry also. Anne must have felt alone and isolated as time went on. However, in the summer of 1535, a ray of hope appeared for Anne when the couple were briefly reconciled. Anne became more accepting of the idea of Henry's mistresses, if not completely silent about them, and Henry made a public display of loyalty to Anne when in July 1535 he sent Sir Thomas More to the scaffold for refusing to swear the oath of supremacy, and after all, if Henry wanted a legitimate son, as things stood, it was only Anne who could provide one. They began the court's summer progress of 1535 with a united front. They visited Salisbury and Porchester first, also visiting Wolf Hall in Wiltshire during this time, the family home of one of Anne's ladies, Jane Seymour, reaching Windsor by November, and when they arrived back in London in late 1535, Anne was pregnant again, for the third time. On hearing the news of Catherine of Aragon's death in July 1535, Anne could not have been happier. Her rival was now gone, and she was carrying another heir for Henry. There were rumours, of course, that Anne had arranged for Catherine to be poisoned, especially when, on the post-mortem, Catherine's heart was found to be blackened. However, this is unlikely, as if she had wanted rid of Catherine enough to kill her, she would surely have done so earlier. After her mother's death, Anne made one last attempt to befriend Mary, writing to her to say that if she were to put aside her obstinacy and obey the king, that Anne would be the best friend to her, and she need not hold the train of Anne's gown on her return to court. Mary again refused, and this would be the last time that Anne would attempt reconciliation with her stepdaughter. Then, on the same day as Catherine's funeral, Anne went into labour prematurely, and after only a 3.5-month gestation, she miscarried a little boy. Anne's grief and frustration must have been plain for all to see, as she wept following this tragedy for her and for Henry. However, the king's grief soon turned to anger at Anne, and the king confronted Anne in her rooms, stating that, quote, he would have no more boys by her. This was a direct threat to Anne, as she was devastated, and even more so when she heard the rumours that the king felt that Anne had been, quote, seduced by witchcraft to induce the miscarriage, and that he ought to find a new wife. Anne remonstrated with Henry and blamed the loss of the child first on the news she was given by the Duke of Norfolk that the king had fallen from his horse, claiming the consequences of his possible death had shocked her to such an extent that it had resulted in miscarriage. When Henry dismissed her reasoning, Anne then claimed that finding the king with Jane Seymour sitting on his knee made her lose her child, as it had been such a shock to her to see for herself that the king had feelings for others. King Henry took little heed of Anne's reasoning, although he did leave Jane Seymour at home during the next court's progress. But with Anne isolated at court after falling out with her ally Cromwell, and with the king becoming further infatuated with Jane Seymour, who cleverly portrayed herself as the mirror image of Anne in all things, Anne was at her wit's end. The king's patience had also finally run out, and on the 24th of April, 1536, a commission led by Thomas Cromwell was set up to investigate Anne, and by May, accusations of adultery were levelled at her, and Henry chose to believe them. The private interrogation of the Queen's household elicited fantastic claims of her degeneracy, accusing her of incest and witchcraft, as well as adultery. Mark Smeaton, a musician in Anne's household, was held in the Tower and tortured until he confessed that he was having an affair with Anne. The king himself questioned Henry Norris over a possible affair with Anne after she dropped her handkerchief to him as one of the jousters at a tournament that she and Henry attended. And then lastly, Anne Boleyn herself was arrested on the 2nd of May by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and was questioned over her behaviour and installed in the Tower of London. Evidence was sought from her ladies-in-waiting, Lady Rochford and Lady Worcester, and from a deathbed note belonging to Lady Wingfield, whom Anne had previously tried to silence, concerning her premarital behaviour with Henry Percy, which suggested that Anne was morally lacking. Cromwell was rumoured to have used all means at his disposal, including torture and bribes, to bring a devastating case against Anne. As well as this, Anne's sister-in-law, Lady Rochford, was said to have admitted that her husband George Boleyn and Anne would openly mock the king, questioning whether he was impotent and whether Elizabeth actually belonged to another father. As she was arrested, Anne pleaded her innocence and asked for the king, but she was denied. She's said to have lost her famous composure and collapsed to her knees. She asked if she would be kept in a dungeon, but was informed that she would be kept in the royal apartments to await her trial. She reportedly alternated between laughing and crying and spoke openly about what brought her to such a position, and her mention of Francis Weston in her rantings meant that he too would be arrested and brought to the Tower, where her brother George had also been taken. The fact that she spoke of Weston, her brother George, Smeaton, and Norris was used as evidence that the crimes she was accused of were true. In addition to the men that Anne spoke of, William Brereton, a member of the King's Privy Council, was also taken to the Tower, along with Thomas Wyatt and Sir Richard Page, all accused of being Anne's lovers. On hearing of Anne's arrest, her bishop Thomas Cranmer sought to distance himself from Anne, which he did in a letter to the king. Whilst privately he may have had sympathy for Anne, no one was brave enough to show it and chance the wrath of the king. Yet despite this, it was only ever Smeaton who confessed to the charges brought against the men who allegedly consorted with Anne. However, it is unlikely that Anne would have had the time or the inclination to have slept with so many men, including her own brother, and the accusations were likely conjured up by Cromwell and Henry to secure Henry's freedom to marry Jane Seymour. Anne went over everything in her mind and prepared her defence, although she would have known in reality that the outcome of the trial would be a foregone conclusion. On the 12th of May, the accused men were taken to court at Westminster Hall. Smeaton confessed to the charges, whilst the other men pled not guilty as accused. All four were found guilty and were sentenced to be hung, drawn, quartered, as well as beheaded. As members of the nobility, Anne and her brother George were tried in the Tower, and having known of the outcome at Westminster Hall, Anne would have fully understood the ramifications for her own trial, which took place on the 15th of May. No Queen of England had ever been placed on trial before, and so a large scaffold was erected in the Tower to house all the people expected to attend the trial. Henry Percy, as well as Thomas Boleyn and Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, were all expected to attend as members of the nobility, although Henry Percy had to leave George Boleyn's trial partway through due to his ill health. Anne, for her part, had no counsel and called no witnesses, but prepared her own defence for the charges brought against her, which laid out specific dates and times that Anne and the accused men had enjoyed carnal knowledge of each other. She was also accused of conspiring to kill the king so that she would be free to marry one of her accused lovers. Anne stood and defended herself of all charges eloquently. However, she was found guilty by each of the nobles, who in turn stood to deliver their verdict, each having no choice but to go along with the king's wishes. The final verdict was read out by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, but in a final twist, he stated that the queen should be either burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure, whereas the usual punishment for treason was to be burned at the stake. At a church court in Lambeth on the 17th of May, Thomas Cranmer annulled the marriage of Anne and the king based on the evidence of a pre-contract that existed between Anne and Henry Percy, so that, quote, she was never lawful Queen of England. On the same day, 5 of the men accused were put to death by beheading, which was a sentence commuted by Henry from the usual hanging, drawing, and quartering, which was the fate of Smeaton alone as a commoner. George Boleyn, Weston, Brereton, and Norris did not confess to any of the crimes on the scaffold, which Anne would have been pleased to hear, and Smeaton's only comment was that he deserved death. Anne continued to protest her innocence, but prepared herself for her certain demise with composure. She even joked with her captor, Kingston, that she had but a small neck, laughing at the irony that she would make the executioner's job all the more easy. She spent her final evening laughing and joking that she may well be known to history as, quote, Queen Anne Lackhead. This was perhaps the last act of defiance open to her. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was taken to the scaffold in front of the gathered nobles and dignitaries. She held her composure and walked with dignity to face the crowd and made the last speech of her life. She spoke briefly and movingly of her love for the king, her sins of pride, and her desire that the people pray for her. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler, nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, a sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best, and thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all, and I heartily desire you all pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me, To God I commend my soul. The king had sent for an expert swordsman from Calais to come to the tower to carry out the execution of the queen. She knelt on the scaffold, as there was no need for a block, and with one swift blow of his sword, her head was removed from her body, and the first Queen of England to ever be executed was dead. And within 24 hours of his second wife's execution, Henry was already betrothed to Anne's lady-in-waiting and the woman who would become his third wife, Lady Jane Seymour. In the aftermath of Anne's death in 1536, abbeys, shrines, and monasteries throughout England were purged of religious relics such as true fragments of the cross and vials supposedly containing the blood of Christ. This statewide systematic clampdown was not only undertaken for theological reasons, but also largely because the seizure of church property brought in colossal amounts of revenue to the royal coffers. Following disturbances and a march against the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry unleashed a brutal repression, and hundreds of rebel leaders were arrested and executed, after which Henry proclaimed that, quote, "Our pleasure is that dreadful execution be done on a good number of the inhabitants of every town, village, and hamlet that have offended in this rebellion." Indeed, even his own family were not spared Henry's wrath, as when Jane Seymour begged him on her knees to restore the abbeys, he exploded with, quote, "Get up, and do not presume to meddle in my affairs. Remember Anne." Anne is well remembered, not only as the second wife of Henry VIII and a leading figure in the Reformation, but also as the mother of Elizabeth, one of the most important monarchs to grace the throne of England. She died on the scaffold with the grace and dignity which had first drawn her to King Henry's attention. But more than this even, Anne was unique. She was a determined, driven woman with a strong personality, who inspired love in a king that bordered on obsession, a truly exceptional woman of her time, who no doubt passed on her strong character to her daughter. What do you think of Anne Boleyn? Was she a saintly figure who inspired love and suffered because of it? Or was she an ambitious sinner who manipulated her way into the king's life for her own ends? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Hello guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel, please visit our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards, such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization, and also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.